Hi, this is Carol Beecham with Fort Bend County Libraries. Welcome to the class Using Military Draft Records in Your Genealogy Research. Military draft records are a useful tool to discover more information about your male ancestors and sometimes their female family members, even if they didn't serve in the military. Registration for the draft was required by the Conscription Acts for the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. We are going to examine the registration records created between 1862 and 1945 and where to find them online. During times of war, local districts conducted registrations to identify men eligible for service. Many of the registration lists still survive today. Men born as early as 1816 and as late as the early 1920s could have been eligible to be drafted for one or more of the wars I mentioned earlier. The registration forms were different for every war, but typically you'll find out information about the registrant's name, residence, age, date and place of birth, race, U.S. citizenship, and occupation. In addition to that, you may find information on prior military service, marital status, the name and address of a family member or contact person, a physical description, and his signature depending on which war your ancestor was drafted for. All of this information can help you with your research. You might find a birth date for an ancestor who was born during the time when states didn't keep vital records. The residence can help you decipher if you have the correct person, especially if you're researching someone with a common name. It can also help you locate someone who is missing in the census records. Plus, it's always fun to know the physical descriptions and occupations of our ancestors. At the beginning of the Civil War, there were a lot of volunteers. Plenty of young men eagerly joined, ready to fight for what they believed in. Plus, everyone thought the war wouldn't last that long. As the war raged on, it was clear that more men were needed. Therefore, the Enrollment Act of 1863 was passed. It required all men aged 20 to 45 to register within their congressional districts. The first Union registration took place on July 1, 1863, followed by 3 smaller enrollments. Men were divided into classes. Class 1 consisted of men between the ages of 20 and 45, plus unmarried men aged 35 to 45. Class 2 was mostly married men between the ages 35 and 45. The Northern draft registers consisted of name, residence, age, race, occupation, marital status, and state or country of birth. Reasons for exemption included mentally or physically impaired, only son of infirm parents or dependent widow, orphans or widowers supporting young children, non-citizens, felony conviction, able to pay a $300 fee or furnish a substitute. If you were wealthy, you could buy your way out of serving in the war by hiring a substitute or paying $300 to the government. $300 would be worth about $5,800 in today's money and was equivalent of a full year's salary for the common man. African American men were exempt from the draft. To help you decipher if you have the right person, you can compare the draft record to your ancestor's 1860 census record and see if things match up. Ancestry.com has digital images of draft records that are titled U.S. Civil War Draft Registrations Records 1863 through 1865. On the screen is one of the examples from that collection. If you look on the right-hand side of the document, it asks about former military service. The first name on the list had served previously and was discharged, which it states under the Remarks section. This is valuable information and cues the researcher to look further into military records such as service and possible pension records. The registrations were assembled into consolidated list. The originals are kept at the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C., in Record Group 110 called Records of the Provost Marshal General. Just because your ancestor registered doesn't mean he served in the war. Each community and state had to fill a quota of men. No one had to be drafted if they were able to meet that quota with volunteers. Therefore, volunteering was heavily encouraged. Massachusetts and Ohio had so many volunteers that they never had to call up any draftees. The Enrollment Act of 1863 wasn't without opposition, especially in New York, where angry working-class men rioted for 5 days, causing loss of life and millions of dollars in property damage. Their anger was fueled by anti-war newspapers that were publishing attacks on the new draft law. New York City had its first draft lottery on July 11, 1863. Soon after, on Monday, July 13th, the rioting began. A mob of several thousand people, some armed with clubs and bats, started attacking military and government buildings. On the third day of the protests, the rioting spread to Brooklyn and Staten Island. Soon after that, thousands of federal troops from New York regiments who had been fighting in the Battle of Gettysburg arrived to stop the rioting. By midnight of July 16th, the New York City draft riots ended. The published death toll from the rioting was 119 people, but the actual number was more like 1,200 according to estimates. The New York draft riots remain the deadliest riots in U.S. history. The Confederate Army dealt with the same struggles of manpower as the Union side, but it was even worse for them. At first they strived to keep the soldiers they already had by granting them cash incentives and furloughs for re-enlistment. Most men had enrolled for only a year. This didn't work as well as they had hoped. Soon after, a law was passed by the Confederate Congress that extended the service of those already in the Army from 12 months to 3 years or the duration of the war. It also called for a draft of all white men from the ages of 18 to 35. An eligible man could provide a substitute and certain essential occupations were exempt. The drafted men would serve in existing state units. There were changes in Confederate conscription policy. The age limit of 35 was expanded to 45 in September of 1862. Slave owners who owned more than 20 slaves were exempt. This stipulation fueled the sentiment that the conflict had become a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Eventually, Congress eliminated the practice of substitution and, in 1864, lowered the minimum age to 17 and raised the maximum age to 50. However, the 17-year-olds and men aged 46 to 50 would only serve in home guards. The conscription records for the Confederate side are not as readily available as the Union ones. Unfortunately, there are no consolidated list of Confederate registrations. Each state in the South conducted its own draft. Few of the Confederate draft registers exist today, and the ones that do are hard to find. You need to look in the state adjutant general's records to find any existing conscription records. Some states publish their adjutant general's records. You might be able to find some for Georgia, Tennessee, and South Carolina. I would contact the state archives for each southern state to see what Civil War military records are available for those states. The 24 million draft registration records for World War I are the largest group of draft records in the U.S. When the U.S. entered the Great War, Congress passed the Selective Service Act on May 18, 1917. By law, all males between the ages of 18 and 45 were required to register for the draft throughout 1917 and 1918. Therefore, if your ancestor was born between September 1872 and September 1900, he probably registered. There is a wealth of genealogical information in the registration cards. There were 3 massive draft registrations that took place for World War I. Each one covered a different range of birth dates, and information varied by registration, but they generally asked name and age, address, date and place of birth, citizenship status, occupation and employer, and race. Additional questions pertaining to marital status, the name and address of the man's nearest relative, his father's birthplace, or information about dependents were asked on some of the forms, but not all. It just depends on which registration your ancestor filled out. This is an example of a card from the third registration. These cards were two-sided. There are a lot of questions relating to appearance with this registration. It's fun to imagine what your ancestor might have looked like. You can get a lot of information from these cards. For one, it gives the birth information of men who were born before vital records were widely kept. It also gives the names of relatives and clues to marriages and naturalization. You even get to see his own signature. World War I draft registration cards are accessible online in databases such as MyHeritage, Ancestrycom, and FamilySearch.org. It's important to note that not all men who registered for the draft served in the military, and not all men who served in the military registered for the draft. At the time World War II came about, there was no longer a draft going on. In anticipation of the escalating world conflict, President Roosevelt signed the Selective Service Act in September of 1940, which required men ages 21 to 36 to register with the local draft boards. On October 16, 1940, over 16 million men registered in the first round. Other registrations followed to record younger men as they came of age. The age limit dropped to 20 and then 18 in 1942. Older men had to register too. At first it was just up to age 44, but later included men aged 45 to 64 who could possibly serve in non-military capacities if needed. Here is an example of a World War II draft registration card. These cards give quite a bit of information, including name, residence and/or mailing address, age and date of birth, birthplace, telephone number, name and address of contact person, and employer's name and address. A physical description of the person is on the backside of the card. It includes race, height, weight, complexion, hair, eye color, and identifying marks. That is a lot of valuable information to be obtained from just one document. The draft registration cards provide more detailed information about their occupation than the census does. You could do some research on their employer to learn more about the company or landowner your ancestor worked for. Pay attention to the place of birth. These draft cards were taken during a high time of immigration. If your ancestor wasn't born in the United States, check immigration and naturalization records for him. Also, look at who they put down as their contact person. Young single men typically put down a parent, as in the example on the screen, but they could have also listed a sibling or some other relative, friend, or even an employer. Married men usually wrote down their spouse. Definitely investigate the relationship if you don't recognize the name listed on the card as the contact person. Compare birth dates and place of birth with census and death records to help you decipher which person is your ancestor if there are multiple cards with the same name. Look for other genealogical records in the town and county listed for place of birth. It would also be fun to compare your ancestors' draft registration cards from World War I as a young man and from World War II as an older man. What differences will you find in address, employment, nearest relative, and physical traits? On the top line of the registration card, there is a serial number listed on the left side of the name. This number was assigned by the federal government for the purposes of the draft lottery. If there is a letter in front of the serial number, it tells you which registration it was. On the screen, you will see what letter represents which registration. In the example card, Isaac has the letter U in front of the serial number, which means he was part of the fourth registration, also known as the Old Man's Registration. It was conducted on April 27, 1942, and registered men who were between the ages of 45 and 64 who weren't already serving in the military. Something to keep in mind is that sometimes the draft board office was located in a neighboring state. Therefore, you have some people who resided in one state but registered it in another if they lived near a state border. Also, young men were required to register for the draft even if they weren't citizens yet. All surviving World War II draft registration cards are now viewable online through subscription-based websites like Ancestry.com and Fold3. FamilySearch.org is a free website that is gradually adding these records as well. We have the library edition for Ancestry.com available at all of our branch locations, but you can only access it within the library. The records are divided on these websites by the old man's registration and younger man's registration. The cards for the old man's registration have been microfilmed and digitized for most states, but not all. There are no fourth registration records available for the states of Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Maine, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, or Tennessee. Parts of other states may be missing as well. Always read the notes that accompany the database to learn about its coverage. Also, there are no younger men's registration records for the state of Maine. The original World War II draft cards are kept at the National Archives location in St. Louis. You can obtain copies by filling out the Selective Service request form available on their website. You can send the form electronically or by mail. The fee is $7. Military draft registration cards are a wonderful glimpse into the life of your ancestor, especially when combined with other evidence. Thanks for watching and happy hunting!